by way of introductory thoughts to this, I will point out something I was finishing up from last time. If the whole structure of Revelation, the vision, is supposed to be divided into 7 units, and if they are to be understood as put together in a chiastic fashion, which is a Hebrew form of organization of thought. Let me just take a step back from that. We teach our children how to make a haiku poem. So you know that for something to be a haiku poem, it has to have a 5-syllable line, a 7-syllable line, a 5-syllable line. And why do we teach them this? Because that is a Japanese way to organize a poem. What's the significance of it? Good question. It's a Japanese way to organize a poem. So I once again revisit this chiasm deal. What's the significance of a chiasm? It's how Hebrew would go about organizing their thoughts. Since John comes out of a Hebrew background, it becomes very interesting when we see potential chiasms, especially when they are as big as whole books. Which is all preparatory. Once again, apologies for just beating on this thing. If Revelation is in fact arranged chiastically, then chapters 12, 13, and 14 are the main point of the story. They get themselves a pride of place. And once we see what chapters 12 through 14 are about, especially chapter 12 here, it becomes a little bit more convincing and compelling that Revelation is intentionally structured in that way. So with that kind of broad view stuff in mind of where we are in John's writing the book of Revelation, let's charge into the various details that are contained here. With that in mind, I will have Sarah do her excellent role of reading for us from the English Standard Translation, chapter 12, verse 1.
And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars.
You will be hard-pressed to find a human in Scripture spoken of with such honor as the woman of Revelation chapter 12. This woman represents the people of God made so by his promise. The woman here is representative of the people of God made so by his promise. The people of God, the woman here is clothed with the sun. In other words, is made radiant and shining, which if you recall what Paul said to the church in Ephesus about what Jesus does for his church, he says, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. A little bit more that the church would be personified, represented as a woman, gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church. Let's let Eric in here. All right, Eric, welcome in. The woman of Revelation chapter 12, spoken of, oh, come on. Wait a minute, I can just do this, right? Click. Yeah, bam. The woman of chapter 12 represents the people of God, and we have just reviewed from Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul talks about Christ making his church radiant like a bride. She shines with the sun. She has the moon under her feet. In other words, she is over creation. She is more valued than. She has a role in reigning. She dominates the earth. We had just seen in chapter 10 a mighty angel who dominated the earth with 1 foot on land and 1 foot in the sea. Well, now the church of God represented by the woman, dominates the earth, as the moon itself is under her feet. She is wearing a crown of 12 stars. The stars, we had been told, representing the angels of the churches, 12 of them representing the people of God, symbolizing that crown of 12 stars. The New Testament people of God are the crowning achievement of God's people. All of that from, she was a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Let us hear what we get in verse 2.
She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth.
What do we remember from the very beginning of the Bible after Adam and Eve's fall into sin? We, of course, remember that the Lord had informed Eve that her pain and struggle would be great in bringing forth children. But we also remember he said, your offspring will crush the serpent's head. This was the promise that her offspring would be the one who undoes the serpent's deception. And so, of course, not only does her crying out in pain remind us of the original curse of sin and its effects, it also reminds us of the many trials and difficulties of the Old Testament people of God as they were awaiting that offspring of Eve to appear among them, beginning right away with Cain and Abel, then along later, just we see all kinds of the offspring being awaited and the struggles of the people while they were awaiting the Lord to make good on that promise. So the woman crying out in pain, what's that mean? It means that the Old Testament people of God went through many struggles before Eve's offspring would come. That's quite a bit to fit in that space I gave for you, but there you go. The struggle of and trials of the people awaiting the offspring to be born. We charge in to verse 3.
And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems.
The serpent, the devil, red in previous parts of Revelation here had meant violence, bloodshed. The prophet's use of sinfulness referenced our sin being scarlet, being a deep red, again lending it to that red being a color to represent violence, bloodshed, sinfulness, rebellion. The 7, what's it got? It's got 7 heads and it's got 7 crowns on his heads. We've become very familiar with the number 7 being the number for divine completeness, which if it weren't on a dragon, if it weren't on a dragon, we'd be very interested to wonder how is this dragon divine? But the context shows us so very blatantly that it is evil. Otherwise, we may think of it as a divine figure. As it is, we are recognizing that the devil is deceiving and pretending to divine authority, to God's authority. That's why the dragon gets to feature 7 in the vision, because the dragon is seeking to deceive the nations and to pretend to God's authority. That he has 10 horns, once again, 10, a number of completion along with 4 in reference to created completeness, a horn being a symbol of strength, so that he has 7 heads and 7 crowns, means the dragon is pretending to God's wisdom and to God's authority in victory with the heads and the crowns, and having the 10 horns indicating that there is great strength and might here in a created sense to this dragon, which represents the devil. So I gave you not as much space to write down what the woman crying out in pain meant in verse 2, whereas in verse 3, even though I went on and on about the different symbols that John got to see there, red, 7 heads and 10 horns and all that, in the end, the dragon represents the devil. And once again, moving along to chapter 12, verse 4.
His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it.
To remind you again, stars from the very off of Revelation here have been used to represent the angels. The tail of the dragon, we had just seen when we saw the 5th and the 6th trumpet demons, the scary demons that had the stings of scorpions, and then there was the demonic forces that were riding, that had smoke and sulfur and fire coming out of their mouths, and they had tails with heads on them that struck the people. So when a tail shows up, when the tail had just shown up, there was a symbolization going on there of the sneaky and unexpected attacks. And so the devil's tail tricked, snuck up on, attacked, deceived a third of the angels to join his rebellion and to become in rebellion with him. Demons were swept out of the heavens by the deception of the devil, by his sneaky attack upon them. Then the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth in order to devour the child the moment it was born. The devil had been attempting, as you review your Old Testament, from Adam and Eve to stop the offspring coming about. Cain, deceived, rose up and murdered Abel. This was the devil working to stop the offspring, to kill the offspring as soon as it was born. This shows up for us again when we see Pharaoh. What was his order concerning the Hebrews? The Pharaoh who rose up, who did not remember Joseph. Kill all the boys. When the Lord brought the people into the land of promise, his charge to them was to get rid of the pagan, false worshiping nations. And a major feature of those false religions, 2 major features of those false religions, let's go with the less obvious one first, temple prostitution. To stop offspring from being raised up in legitimate families, to stop the continuing on of a civilization by means of erroneous and improper use of sexuality, the Lord having made us male and female so that husbands and wives would join one another. There's no mention of prostitution in that, and since temple prostitution was such a major feature of the false religions, we see there an attempt of the devil to stop the offspring coming among us. The more obvious one, another major feature of those false religions, was child sacrifice. So and then when we get to Jesus' birth story, what do we remember about Herod? He ended up ordering that all of the children, male 2 years and under, around Bethlehem, be put to the sword. We see through all of Scripture the dragon crouching before the woman, waiting in order to devour its child the moment it was born. This Old Testament and even into the New Testament reveals many attempts of the devil to stop the promised offspring being born. What is the significance of the dragon waiting to devour the baby? The devil trying to stop the Lord's promise of the offspring who is going to crush his head, which we see again all through the course of the biblical history. Taking a breath. Hearing from chapter 12, verse 5.
She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne.
Now, when I hear about someone ruling with an iron scepter, with a rod of iron, in my post-dictatorial experience, where we typically don't really like dictators, I'm looking your way, Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin. We don't typically love monarchs. I'm looking your way, Henry VIII and others. Normally, a rod of iron is understood by our popular imagination as a less than positive thing. Here, of course, it is in the hand of the child who was to be born, who is to rule the nations with an iron scepter, and an iron scepter not symbolizing the firm harshness that we have become accustomed to being the case with dictator situations, but being that unbreakable authority. Once again, remembering Jesus' words, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So the child represents Jesus, who has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. And snatched up to God's presence, being snatched up to God, this represents that Jesus has ascended to the right hand of the Father. The child being snatched up to God represents Jesus is ascended to the right hand of the Father. So yes, in this vision of chapter 12 with the woman and the dragon, Jesus' whole life, death, and resurrection is more or less skipped. He's born, and then he is ascended. So in this vision, it doesn't really spend any time on Jesus' mighty deeds. We get those alluded to in other parts of the vision, but for this one right here, the devil has failed to stop him. He is snatched up to God. He is ascended to sit at the right hand of the Father. From thence he will come to judge the living and the dead. The dragon was unable to devour the child. Taking a breath. Hearing verse 6.
And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days.
Where have we seen the 1,260 days before? It was just in the previous chapter when it was describing the length of time that the two witnesses would be in activity, who were representing the work of the church amidst the struggles and toils of the world. The 1,260 days, these are the 3.5 years. These are the time, and half a time. These are the 42 months that get mentioned. They are representing so where did we seen this before? We've seen this in chapter 11. And it is about the time for suffering. It is about the time for perseverance, for endurance. It is not the final outcome. The place prepared by God represents the protection from damnation that the people have because of God's faithfulness to his promise to protect them. We will get back into the wilderness bit in just a little bit. But let us take just a little bit of a moment here. We've seen the 1,260 days before in chapter 11. It's the work of the church amidst the struggles. We got a little bit of an excursus to take into Job and into Romans, and then we will come back for verses 12, chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. And in Job chapter 1, see how I'm imposing upon our wonderful intern, Sarah, to tell us what is written for us in Job chapter 1, verse 6. And you guys can listen and say, where did Satan go in Job chapter 1, verse 6?
I love how these Bible pages are so thin.
Onion skin. That way they can fit like thousands of them between the bindings.
All right, verse 6. Okay. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them.
So where did Satan go, Sarah?
To present himself before the Lord.
He went right before the Lord. Where did Satan go? He went right before the Lord. All right, let's hang on to that. We're coming back to that in a moment. Would you please read from Romans chapter 8, verse 34? And the question for us, where is Jesus and what is Jesus doing at present, right now, in the now? Romans chapter 8, verse 34.
Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us.
Where is Jesus?
At the right hand of God.
What's he doing?
Interceding for us.
All right. So now Jesus is before God, interceding for us. There were many more verses back up here in Job chapter 1, but what ends up happening is Eric, welcome back in, Eric. Welcome back in, Eric. Is that Satan was in the presence of God, and we find out that he was accusing Job. Jesus is in the presence of God, and what is he doing? Interceding for us. Well, let us get what I would hope is getting to be a pretty obvious answer already. Where can Satan no longer go? Sarah, would you please read verses 7 through 10 for us?
Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God.
Satan can no longer go in the presence of God to accuse you and me, to accuse the church, his radiant bride, the people of God who are clothed with the sun and whose footstool is the moon and who has a crown with 12 stars on it. He had been, and we saw that in Job, but now only the mediator is allowed, the one who intercedes for us, and he has God's ear. So this vision of verses 7 through 12, this takes place after the ascension. We also had seen that we got our 10-minute time limit, our 10-minute clock is going now. We had also seen when the fifth trumpet was blown, remember a star was hurled to the earth and given the keys to the abyss, and we saw coming out of the abyss all these demonic creatures. Well, here in this great and wondrous sign, we saw the dragon sweep a bunch of stars down to the earth, and now the dragon himself, having been hurled down to earth again. We have seen the same event twice. The devil is no longer allowed in God's presence to accuse us, but is limited to going around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But we have been sealed by the work of the Holy Spirit, protected. The accuser can no longer bend God's ear against us. All right. Could you read verse 13 for us? I got a brief comment on that.
And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child.
I did skip right over the rest of the song there with verses 11 and 12, but right here in verse 13, see, the devil failed to stop Jesus. He did not succeed in devouring the child, so now he seeks to destroy those whom Jesus loves. Let us see how that goes for him. Verse 14, please.
But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, and times, and half a time.
So this restates again verse 6, which had said, the woman fled off to the desert, where the place was prepared for her, that she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, which here is just simply stated again as times, and half a time. Time being understood as the word for year, and sure enough, if you get 1 time plus 2 times plus a half a time, you get 3.5 years, you get 1,260 days. It's the same time marker, just stated poetically in the midst of the vision. But if you want to gather in meanings for the woman and the wings and so on, if you must, because again, it's just laid out for you what's happening here. The woman is being protected, the church is being protected. But if you want, we had just read in worship today from Isaiah chapter 40, where the Lord had said, wait for the Lord. Those who wait for the Lord will fly like they got the wings of eagles. So the wings mean that the Lord is giving to his people his rescue, his protection. Wings like he had promised in Isaiah chapter 40. And if you must, this is us returning to the wilderness that was mentioned in verse 6, now making a little more blatant. If you must, the wilderness means God is protecting us now as he had protected and led his people through the wilderness before they came into the promised land. We remember especially there was a lot of grumbling, but there was so much miraculous provision of manna, of water, of safety from their enemies, of clothes never wearing out, of the Lord always providing his word and his leadership amongst them, giving them signs of his presence and the like. If you must, what does the wilderness mean? It means as the Lord was with his people in the wilderness on their way to the promised land, he is with us now in order to provide for us the needs of body and soul, his very presence. Could you also read verse 15?
The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood.
Remember, the devil is pretending to divine authority, and when God wanted to destroy all he had made, how did he do it? He swept it away with a flood. The devil here trying to kill with a flood as God had once done. But
the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth.
see, God had promised that he would not destroy again by means of a flood, and his creation obediently enforces the Lord's promise. Creation still, even though the devil is here, seeking whom he may devour, creation still is obedient to its creator despite the presence of the devil. Taking a breath and hearing from verse 17.
Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea.
So the woman's offspring, the offspring of the people of God, they are those who have believed her witness. It's explained right there. They are the ones who obey God's commands and hold to the testimony of Jesus. It may be, though, and this is interesting, it may be that the woman's offspring is meant to represent individual Christians. you see, in the first place, the devil had tried to destroy the offspring, so that the Christ would be destroyed. He failed. And then in this chapter, the attempts by the devil to destroy the church are described and pointed out that they fail. So perhaps instead then, the devil turns his attention, failing to have destroyed the Christ, failing to have destroyed the Christ's church as a whole. Now his attack turns to individual Christians, seeking to separate them one from another. Who are the woman's offspring? It's explained right there in the text. They obey God's commands. They hold to the testimony of Jesus. It is certainly, though, a strong word of warning that the woman's offsprings, those who hold to the testimony of Jesus and obey God's commands, still are subject to the devil's attacks, which goes all the way back again to that fifth trumpet, where the city of God is trampled. There is suffering in the midst whilst we await the return of Jesus to make all things new. Taking then our last breath, our last breath before we get into the final thing I want to be about. So as a whole, it is compelling to understand chapter 12 here as a vision of the Bible's history from Genesis till Jude, till the time of the church. From Genesis with the fall and the promise, to the devil's attempts to stop it, to the success of the Christ and the establishing of his church and of its ministry and going forth. It is compelling that chapter 12 is a vision of the Bible's history from Genesis on to Jude, which in turn makes it then compelling to think that chapters 12 to 14 are going to be the heart of the Revelation vision. And because, the coming of the Christ among us and the accomplishment of God's plan is central to the Christian faith, and if chapters 12 through 14 are a vision version of that, well then, it seems just a little bit more likely that, in fact, Revelation is arranged chiastically, because here is the central point, the main thing. And the use of Revelation being arranged chiastically, it's not just kind of like, why is a haiku a haiku? The use of it is, it helps you to hold on to this whole thing as you meditate on it, wondering about those visions that lead up to, here's the main point. God has promised to send forth his Son, and he has preserved him, and he has been raised up to have all authority, and he continues to protect his people who believe in the testimony of Jesus and hold on to it. So the chiastic arrangement as a potential, I hope it is useful for us to hold on to the whole crazy 7-section vision of Revelation in order to make sense of it. I'm going to stop screen share. We're down to our last seconds. And any questions, comments?